So thanks for having this opportunity to talk about ARC linkage projects and some of my experiences. My name is Paul Burke. I'm Associate Professor in the UTS Business School in Marketing and also Deputy Director of our Centre for Business Intelligence and Data Analytics, also known as BEDA. So I was asked to talk about two linkage projects that I've been involved in. The first was to look at visitor frequency at museums in particular, how to increase them. So you can imagine museums have many different attributes in terms of focusing on education or entertainment or edutainment to combine together. It could be in terms of opening hours and whether to extend them over summer, types of exhibitions, how much to charge for special exhibitions, whether to do joint promotions with other museums, with parking stations, or back in the day with IMAX, for instance. So these were the type of attributes that museums can play with, and that was the challenge that they were facing. So basically what we offered is a choice modelling approach to try and quantify those incentives and to see how changes in those types of attributes would drive up visitation rates and the type of segments that would be most responsive to that in terms of whether it's families, whether in terms of singles without or couples without children. And originally we worked with, or part of the ARC project was to work with 6 of the major museums on the southeast coast of Australia, including War Memorial, Powerhouse Museum and the National Maritime Museum. So this was back in 2004 and it was quite a sizable grant at the time. The relationship started some years before that through one of the CIs had been working with some museums in an academic process partnership, was also involved in some of the discussions around the museum at the time. And so we worked on a pilot project with the Maritime and the Powerhouse Museum. And that really strengthened the application, but it also strengthened our ability to talk to other stakeholders who eventually came on board because we actually had a proof of concept type of product there. And that helped to get some initial buy-in in terms of the application process. It also helped with the education part on both sides of the project. We learnt more about the museums by visiting them and talking with the stakeholders. We did an extensive qualitative research with consumer segments, attending those museums. And at the same time, we were teaching them about some of the methodologies and the things that we were looking for. So it's really important to maintain a relationship with your partners before the project and also during the project. Unfortunately, it does present a lot of challenges, the more partners that you have. So we were working with 6 Australian museums. They've all got different constitutions in terms of the ability to charge an entry fee, for instance, like the War Memorial is not permitted to do so. And others had commercial interest in terms of how much they could get through the special exhibitions, all these different things. And even things like location. Some of the more central museums in Sydney, for instance, were looking to do partnerships with other museums located within that vicinity and also partnering with things like IMAX and parking stations. So managing those expectations throughout the project, even before the project, was a bit of a challenge. And I do err on the side of caution for those looking to work with multiple partners. It's not to say that you shouldn't be. I think, in fact, there's a lot of benefit from working with multiple partners because it does, particularly when you're working in including a not-for-profit organisation, it does get away from that concept that potentially this research is commercial orientated rather than looking at the objectives of the ARC linkage program, which is to basically deliver on research with impact in a number of different areas. And so working with a not-for-profit, for instance, can help strengthen that if you were combining that with a commercial entity. One of the things that I found very useful was that we conducted an end-of-project summary with all the partners. We visited them, we spent at least a day doing workshops with them in terms of summarising the outcomes of the project and also looking at steps forward and teaching them some new ways to do it on their own. That was really useful in the sense that it gave us a chance to take stock of what we'd achieved as part of the project, thinking about the research impact and then thinking about positioning for publications that came after that. So for me, I think sometimes we move very quickly once a project is completed, and I'll speak to that as part of the next project. So the next project was working with Grain Growers Australia to look at the value of characteristics of Australian wheat. So you can imagine the Australian wheat market is a huge export for Australia in terms of the economy, and obviously the employment that comes as part of delivering that project that product, I should say, to overseas markets. It's a huge product in terms of exports, particularly in Australia, the Asian markets, Korea and Japan, obviously. And Australia has a fantastic product. We make a wheat that's very suitable for the end product being udon noodles, for instance. But there are a lot of characteristics. So the role of our project was to look at all the characteristics that define wheat in terms of its colour, in terms of its texture, in terms of the ship uniformity, in terms of things like whether there's a report that comes with the shipment, and then looking at all those different characteristics and asking millers and food processors over there in the Asian markets, in particular Japan and Korea, how they're making decisions about whether to buy a wheat parcel from Australia or from some other part of the world, or just more generally. And you can imagine all these different attributes exist, and we wanted to quantify, well, what's the most important relative to the most important? You can imagine that's a valuable insight for the stakeholders of Grain Growers Australia, which are in fact the farmers. So Grain Growers actually approached us in the first instance, working with CENSOC, the Centre for the Study of Choice, which was at UTS for many years, one of the first research centres, I suppose, that I was involved in. And basically we also had a relationship through that centre with Richard Carson, who's an economist from University of California. And so we were able to put all our strengths together and present a very convincing case to undertake this research. So I think that partnership that we had through CENSOC, through San Diego, California, and also the academic experience that what we call the partner investigators had, or what we call PIs, they actually had some previous experience in working in the academic space. So, for instance, one of the PIs had worked at the University of Sydney. So they kind of got the idea that what the ARC assessors were looking for from an academic point of view and how to communicate that. But at the same time, they had the scientific expertise and the industry expertise when talking about wheat as a product and the export market that presents. So in terms of that partnership, it was absolutely essential that we had them on board, particularly in terms of the in-kind contribution and the network that they had already established with the overseas millers. So we were actually able to visit the millers with the PIs to conduct the research. And you can imagine that this is a small number of buyers over there in Korea and South Korea that represent the entire country there. And we were able to actually get data collection taking place with these people. And we took laptops over there with that were designed by CENSOC to actually basically sit the laptop in front of the millers. They're all translated and translated back for checking in terms of converting from English to Korean, or English to Japanese, I should say. And they actually sat there and were engaged with the research process. And they were quite interested in the research that we were doing. From our perspective, it was absolutely insightful to the point that we were almost discouraged from publishing the findings because it was so insightful for the Australian wheat industry. So we talk about research with impact. Well, we actually had that research with impact, and that was being then developed further in terms of changing the way in which that wheat product is produced and the eventual outcome. So the other arm of Grain Growers Australia was looking at it from a scientific point of view to change the yield and what that looks like after a period of time. So that also creates some sort of conflict of interest, I suppose, in terms of doing research with impact and having that disseminated on a wider level, which is obviously of interest to the ARC. The other challenge that we found is that the CI and PI team were made up of people coming up to the end of their careers and sort out retirement, and also moving on to other industry bodies. So that does present a challenge in terms of the outputs that are achieved. And so it's always important to double check about, what was agreed upon and some of the milestones in the research process. I couldn't say that I've done any ARC project that has gone to plan, absolutely not. And so, trying to find those that timeline and revisit it with the partners is, I think, of value. So my overall comments, I've been involved in a number of ARC projects, in terms of DECRA and also Discovery Grant as well. So, and also sitting on the other side as an assessor. With linkage projects in particular, I think it's the relationships that take time, and people forget that as part of the application process. You can't just simply say, oh, well, let's do a linkage grant in this area and you're going to find a partner. You really have to look at the network that you've got, and if you don't have that network, to go out and seek it and start developing it. Joint applications do take time. There is a need to develop a strong application, and it's strengthened by some of the previous work that you've been able to do together. So if that involves a pilot project, then by all means, I would encourage you to do that. But then think about the timeline that's involved. So let's say, for instance, you want to apply this year. Are you better off waiting to do something small this year and then potentially apply to the ARC the year after? I think choosing your team wisely is also recommended. Don't just think that you need to get professors. There is a case that can be made to the ARC to include early career researchers and mid-career researchers on the application process. And really they use that rope assessment strategy to look at the research team. And we're looking for teams that are made up of people who bring expertise into the area and are complementary to the team. And that includes the PIs. So there is a case to be made in terms of the PIs that you're going to include as part of that application process. I think the application for linkages is very much under the theme of research with impact, but it needs to be understood by an assessor who may not be familiar with the industry or may not be familiar with the academic code that you're potentially targeting. We do see assessors looking at areas that they're potentially not expertise in. So really having a strength of story that comes from a clear explanation and an explanation that they can see the value of the research. I think that's really important for linkages, if not all applications to the ARC. And don't be discouraged if you're unsuccessful the first time. I can speak from experience. We had an application for a discovery. We couldn't actually demonstrate that we worked together extensively with all members of the team because we had a couple of publications that were forthcoming and they were just winding up in terms of that revise and resubmit. And we got what they call a near miss, and we're invited to apply again the year after. And by this stage, the team was even more fully developed, and we had a couple of other things to add to the project, and that really strengthened the application the second time around. And we were successful with the discovery. In terms of we had a multidisciplinary application, so a number of members from Faculty of Arts, Social Sciences and Business coming together, and that was a real great project as well. ARC, of course, is not the only area for seeking funding. There are a number of different bodies that can help in terms of that, and you should speak to the Research Office for more information. So I encourage you to consider ARC linkages as part of the suite of applications and sources of funding, but obviously continue to source other sources of funding. It sounds quite strange, but I think you can understand that strengthening your application by piloting your instruments and whatever it might be in the teams, I think is of value to the eventual application that you submit. So I wish you all the best with your research endeavours, and particularly around ARCs. Thank you.